The 37th Infantry Division was the principal unit that fought for the Battle of Munda.
The battle took place to capture an airstrip.
It's incredible what they went through.
They dug in and they did their job. It was a bloody job.
9 men from the county died in the same battle.
They sacrificed everything.
A Soldier's Story, Never Forgotten, is made possible through the generous support of Albert H. Horn, Jr. in honor of the 9 men from Hardin County, Ohio, who sacrificed their lives while fighting in the Battle of Munda. Also by viewers like you. Thank you.
The 37th Division was the Ohio National Guard Division, first organized in 1917 for World War I. They fought in France and Belgium during the war. In 1919, returned to Ohio. And by 1921, we had enough units to officially reorganize the 37th Division. It was primarily 4 infantry regiments, 1 in each sort of corner of the state. You know, the necessary field artillery, engineer units, medical, quartermaster, the support units that support the division. These guard units were hometown boys. These were hometown guard units. It was, in some cases, more of a social club than sometimes a military organization. If you look down the roster on October 15th, 1940 of Company E, you're going to see a lot of the same last names. You're going to see brothers and uncles and cousins, people that knew it. They went to high school with each other. They grew up together. They knew each other. In 1940, as you know, war clouds in Europe were starting to roll in, and in the Pacific as well. President Roosevelt and the War Department felt that, you know, we weren't quite prepared as what we should be as a country and as a military force. You know, we're coming out of the Depression. You know, funding through those years in the 1920s and 30s was slim, and we were still using a lot of these World War I tactics, you know, that we learned in the trenches and there, and you know, it sort of led to the leadership of this country saying we need to sort of prepare ourselves a little bit better, just in case. In August and September of 1940, the 37th Division learns that they're going to be inducted into federal service for 1 year's worth of training. On October 15th, 1940, the 37th and the 148th Infantry met at their armories early in the morning and were mustered in the federal service for 1 year. The 148th specifically was a Northwest Ohio regiment. The headquarters was in Toledo, and contained units, you know, Toledo, Bowling Green, Findlay, Ottawa, Napoleon, all the way down to Sydney. And there were, obviously, Company E was from Kenton. The division was ordered to Camp Shelby, Mississippi, just outside of Hattiesburg, Mississippi, for this year's training. In the summer of 1941, they participated in what we call the Louisiana maneuvers. They were some Army-sized maneuvers that pitted 2 fictional forces against each other in Louisiana in an attempt to sort of exercise the muscles, see, you know, how did the training go, evaluate what needed to be corrected, what needed to be further training conducted. And shortly after returning from the field back to Camp Shelby, they find out they're going to be extended for additional months of training. And again, this is as wars, and they're watching the war in Europe and the Pacific continue to build and swell.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
You know, everything came to a big change in December 7th, 1941, when the attacks on Pearl Harbor happened. You know, they heard it that Sunday morning. Sunday was a leisurely day. There wasn't much planned. You know, guys were taking showers or hanging out in their tents, and came across the radio, the news, and so that's how they found out. February, March of 1942, they're shipped to Fort Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania, in anticipation of being shipped overseas to Europe. Things in the Pacific weren't going quite as well. There was a concern that the Japanese were continuing to get closer and closer to Australia and New Zealand. So they quickly sent the division back across the United States to San Francisco in May of '42 and shipped them initially to Fiji, the Fijian Islands, where they set up defenses, continued training, and throughout 1942 and early 1943. In the spring of '43, following the completion of the main Battle of Guadalcanal, which was sort of the first significant American fight in the Pacific, the division was sent to Guadalcanal. The combat was over, but they continued to conduct mop-up operations, some additional training, replace the troops that were there that were needed to rest. General MacArthur and his staff in the Pacific had devised a plan called Operation Cartwheel. Operation Cartwheel was centered on eliminating the Japanese. One of their strongest positions in the Pacific was at Rabaul. General MacArthur and the staff knew they couldn't just attack it. They didn't have enough ships. They didn't have enough soldiers and equipment yet that were trained and ready to fight. So they decided, instead of directly attacking this almost impossible task, they would sort of engulf all the Japanese positions on other islands in the Pacific and encircle them and sort of squeeze, force the Japanese to send replacements and equipment to other islands where the Americans were attacking, and sort of squeeze them out of Rabaul. The strategic thing about New Georgia was it had an airfield that the Japanese could use as a refuel point between Rabaul and Guadalcanal. They were still, even though the ground combat on Guadalcanal was over, they were using it as a refuel point, sort of halfway in between, and continuing to conduct air raids and harass, American ships near Guadalcanal and in the Soloman Islands. So that was sort of the objective, was to capture this airfield, flip it to American use. It was sort of the next thing on this island hopping campaign that they could use to project air power and land power from. So they selected the 43rd Division, which was a National Guard division out of the New England area, as the division to complete this task. And the 37th, still being fresh from the United States, not having the combat experience, but being fresh, we're sort of you're on standby, you're on alert. If anything happens and we need you, you're going to be the first sort of phone call we make. The Japanese were putting up a little bit more of a fight than what they expected. It wore on these soldiers. The 148 specifically, they got the alert on the night of the 7th, or very early in the morning on the 8th. And the 2nd Battalion, which Company E was part of, was the first elements that were sent to land on New Georgia. And it was by morning, by the time the sun came up, they had landed and loaded their supplies on the beach. And very quickly were ordered to relieve the 169th Infantry, which was part of the 43rd Division. They spent the first couple of days sort of getting themselves set. The Japanese were sort of in these small, 4 or 5 man groups that were just harassing the supply lines and harassing the rear areas, and little ambushes would pop up. You're on an island that doesn't have a lot of infrastructure, so they're cutting roads with bulldozers. They're putting engineers on bulldozers, with 4 or 5 armed soldiers riding along to protect them. The plan was to make this a 2-division attack. What they quickly determined was that they outflanked the Japanese by the whole regiment. It's a very dense forest, and you can't see more than 20 or 30 yards in any direction, so you don't find these enemy positions until you're on top of them. And so by the 28th, they're completely surrounded. And that's where some of the most vicious fighting occurs. the casualties begin to amount. They're using people from the band and typists and clerks to defend the ration dump. They sort of lose command and control as everyone's sort of fighting in all four directions. They couldn't get supplies, they couldn't get water up from the water point, they couldn't evacuate the wounded. Some of them died because of that. 31st of July, they make one final push to break through and restore the lines. Finally, on the morning of August 1st, sort of an ad hoc battalion, which included Company E, was able to make their final push out and restore the lines. They did the final push to Munda Airfield as a corps, and again with the 148 being on the right, they went almost unopposed and pushed the Japanese basically into the sea. What was left of them went north to the northern part of the island and evacuated off from there. By the middle of August, all the Japanese fighting's done, the airfield's secure, and then at the end of August, beginning of September, the regiment's returns to Guadalcanal for a rest and refitting and receiving replacements.
I got a phone call one day from a lady who identified herself as Jenny Horn. And she said she was calling on behalf of her father, wanted to know what Hardin County was going to do to commemorate the anniversary of the Battle of Munda. At that time, I thought to myself, there were a lot of uncles killed in a lot of battles during World War II. I said, why is this special? And she said, there were 9 men from Hardin County who died in the Battle of Munda. I had never heard about it before. So she and I decided that we would meet, and her father, Al, would be coming with her to meet with me. And between that time and the time she called, I consulted with several local historians about the Battle of Munda. None of them were any more familiar with it than I was.
And I saw this and I said, this is unbelievable. Something's got to be done. So I called Jennifer and I said, Jennifer, you're going to have to help me. She went to Kenton and she went to the high school. She went other places and nobody knew anything about it. I said to her, I'm going to do something, spend some money to get this going. Somehow she hooked up with Dan Robinson.
We finally got together the day after Thanksgiving, and Al brought along his newspapers that were in perfect condition. And he started to educate me on the Battle of Munda. It became a part of my life. It was a story that kind of took a life of its own. Although the community had forgotten about the Battle of Munda, the families couldn't forget about it. After I learned the facts of what had happened at the battle and the story about Jack Castor and his fiancée and some of the other stories that Al had, I started to make contact with some of the families of the victims, the 9 men and their families.
I was 4 years old. I just turned 4 when my dad was killed. I remember seeing him home. I was between 3 and 4, and he was on his way.
At the time, I mean, it affected our family in a big way. It had to be tough on my grandpa and grandma that had kids over there fighting, as well as any other family. I mean, it wasn't just our family, it was all of them.
You know, I knew, Uncle Bill, died over there and stuff. When you're a kid, you don't understand a lot of the stuff, what's going on here or there. How did it affect Dad and, and the family and everything? I think, it's hard. It's, for over 4 years, overseas and stuff. I think it's hard on all of them, and yeah, it affects everybody.
Billy Thompson's father was killed in the battle. She was named Billy after her father. She didn't see her dad at a time when she would remember it. She was just a baby when he left.
He was the youngest of 6 children. born to James and Gertrude Thompson. He had 2 brothers, Hardin and Gail, and 3 sisters, Laverta, Garnet, and Pauline, and many nieces and nephews. I was only 16 months old when he died at the age of 23, a time when most young men are just starting. He was able to come home on leave shortly after I was born, and he did get to see me before he shipped out for the South Pacific. He wasn't happy that my mom wanted to name me Billy after him. He did not think Billy was an appropriate name for a girl. And I'm always glad that my mom insisted on naming me Billy after my dad, because I'm really proud of his service and his sacrifice.
I know that he was a character. I know that he liked to drink beer and have fun. Family stories would probably characterize him as something of a character. He had lots of friends and apparently was popular, but he also attended Mass on Sundays and on Wednesdays and had communion whenever the chaplain was able to distribute communion. So he was a man of faith. He was respected and honored and loved. I think mothers and fathers proudly gave up their sons and sometimes their daughters. It was the 40s. You picked up and you went on. These were people of the Depression. They had seen loss. They had suffered loss. My grandparents were people of very modest means. It was a matter of commitment and stoicism and acceptance and probably faith that allowed them to go on. And I wonder now if that is perhaps why we didn't know as much about Leroy then in our growing up years as we do now.
Basil Armentrout was my mother's brother, and he was the youngest of the family. Basil was like a brother to me. My mother took care of him, took care of us. We had a big tree in front of the house, and she told us one day, said, go out and look behind that tree. So Joe and I went out, and when we went around the right side, he went around the other side, and it was Basil. And then he stopped, and we ran into him, and he hollered at us, scared us. My grandmother was a very strict person, and she told us to sit on the steps and don't say a word and don't move until she told us. And of course everybody was hugging and kissing, and my mother came out and sat between us, and she said, we just got word that Basil was killed. It was a tragic news. And of course we sat there and cried about it. But he was always in uniform. And every time he would come out to the house, he would come out to see us. I remember so much about him that it was hard for me to accept the fact that he was gone. And we had a funeral at the gym in the old high school. But I had a friend that was in the battle, and he survived. And he told my mother, he said, I held Basil in my arms while he died. He was hit by a mortar fragment. It was like losing a brother because he was so close to us. And Joe loved him, and we all did. And he's buried out here at Preston Cemetery with his mother and dad.
I'm quite sure it was a blow to them. It was a void in their life. They expected him to come home, get married, have a family. Then the caster name would go on. It all terminated. There'll no be anybody else name of the caster anymore. It's gone. And that's the same with the other boys. When you're young, you don't think you're going to get killed. Old men make war, young men fight war. I don't know these men. I'd like to have known them. And after you read all what they went through, it's hell. It's recognition that's well overdue. I had to do something.
Some of these young men who lost their lives were already popular within the community. It's not like it is today. Back then, the news took a long time for it to get back to Hardin County. The names came back slowly. The bodies that came back slowly, sometimes 2 or 3 at a time. Some stayed in the South Pacific and still are there. But there was not like the opportunity for the community to have a big parade and honor the men of Company E. They just came back at different times with different stories. That's part of the reason that there wasn't more of a historical impact here.
There's something that's history from right here locally, here in Kenton and here in Hardin County, that should be remembered.
So we started taking donations for this marker and decided we would dedicate it on the 75th anniversary of the battle. We had military people, speakers. We had an honor guard. We had the pastor, who was a relative of one of the men who was killed. Members of the family spoke and remembered the loved ones. It was a very, very moving experience. We ran a series in the Kenton Times, 2-part series, about the Battle of Munda and the men who died there, the men who were wounded there, and the community that mourned for them.
The memorial that they had last year was it was overwhelming. It was something that was really special. We don't want to forget those guys. You have to imagine yourself if you had to leave your wife and your kids with the possibility of never returning to see them. They sacrificed everything.
That's why you got to respect that. I get emotional on that. I know, I do. I feel that I'm doing a little bit of something for someone. And, you know, as a survivor of the war, I had a good life. I didn't go through the hell those guys did.
We should never forget what it costs for us to live like we do. It costs the lives of not just the 9 men from Hardin County, but the lives of thousands of other men.
We have a great life in this country, brought about by the sacrifice of a lot of men and women fighting wars and things like that. Not only this war, but a lot of the others.